As this is Labor Day weekend, we celebrate labor, we celebrate work. Many of you have the day off tomorrow. And I was drawn to the concept of what does it mean to work for Jesus? What does it mean to volunteer, to serve, to do the things that Jesus has called us to do? Because we're all called to work. We're all called to put forth effort for Jesus. And this made me think of the different jobs that I've had throughout my life. And the first job that I had that I got paid for was baling hay. And if you've ever baled hay, I think you know how miserable it is. Unless you're in the tractor that's climate controlled for whatever reason. But it's just not a fun experience. You can only do it when it's really dry, and usually that also means it's really hot, and it's sunny, and so you're in the field, and there's hay. In my experience, the hay bales were either on the ground or being shot out from the baler onto the wagon, and we're loading them that way. And you're hot. It's just not a desirable experience. And you get hay everywhere, and it's not fun. You get sunburned, dehydrated, all those types of things. And there's no shade anywhere. Now, the only time you get relief from the sun is when you have to take the bales into the barn to put them away. And then you're like, oh, there's shade. And then you realize, well, this isn't any fun either. And because there's no breeze, it's hot, it smells, it's just terrible. And on top of all this, I'm allergic to hay. Now, it's not one of those things where I break out in hives or can't breathe, but it bothers my allergies. And I can drive by a freshly cut alfalfa field and be like, oh, I hate that smell. And it's not just because of the memories associated, while that may have something to do with it. It's hard work, and that was the first job that I got paid for. But we recognize we are called to work. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, it says, "Work willingly at whatever you do as though you are working for the Lord rather than for people." So as we do our work, whatever that is, whether it's paid, whether it's volunteer, whether it's something for ourselves or somebody else, we are called to do it for Jesus. But as Paul is writing this in Colossians, there's this underlying implication: everyone must work. He's saying there is no one that is called to be on the sidelines. Everyone is called to be a contributor in the game. You are called to work. Now, your call to work is different than somebody else's call to work. So it's not as though we compare ourselves to each other, but we are called to work. And why I say that is we do not need to judge ourselves by worldly standards. A worldly standard, particularly in a capitalistic economy, if you don't make me money, I'm not going to pay you for that. And we don't judge in the same way. Now, as followers of Jesus, we still need to be prudent and wise of our resources and use them appropriately, but we don't judge in the same way the world judges. And part of this means that we need to make sure we don't overlook certain jobs or responsibilities as, well, that's not as important. Well, from a worldly standpoint, maybe that's true, but from a kingdom standpoint, it's not true. See, Jesus has called you to work, and the work that he has called you to do is important because it's for the kingdom, not because it's for the world. So we don't demean others for what they do or what they don't do. We are called to work for the Lord. Now, as I think about this, I want to make sure you know you were not created to be lazy. You were created to do work. And I'm going to pack that a little bit more as we get into this, but keep that in the back of your mind. But you don't have to conform to others either. Your responsibility as a worker for Jesus is not to look like somebody else, is not to shape yourselves to fit someone else's expectations. So somebody may be able to do a job better than you. Great. You weren't created to be that person. You were created to be the person that God created you to be. Now, when we think of this, when we think of what Paul is saying, whatever you do, work as though you're working for the Lord, not for humans, this should make us have pride in what we do. Regardless of who you are, regardless of what you're doing, regardless if it's a job you're getting paid for, regardless if it's a volunteer situation, whatever it is, we should have pride in what we're doing because we are doing it for Jesus. Now, there's this phrase that it says, "Do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life." That's baloney, in my opinion. Because even if you love it, it's still work. It is. I talked about baling hay. Some of you have hay fields and have made money on that, so you say, it's hard work, but I love doing it. Maybe nobody enjoys baling hay, I don't know. But it's still work. And so let's make sure we don't downplay the discipline and the effort that is required to do the work that God has called us to do. But it's not about filling a position or fulfilling a responsibility. It's about exploring our passions and gifts. How has God gifted you? Maybe He's gifted you in this way or that way. Maybe He's gifted you over here. It's not a matter of conforming to others. Pursue how God had gifted you. Because our motivation should derive from the fact that we are working for God. And so on some levels, we can say God is our boss. Sometimes it's hard to tangibly wrap our minds around that. It might be strange to actually consider that. Because whether it's volunteer or paid, you're almost always reporting to someone else. But see, if you honor God with your work, you are going to do your work well. You can't honor God and do a bad job on purpose because you were lazy. Now, just because you do a bad job doesn't mean you were lazy. That's not what I'm necessarily getting at either. But if your boss asks you to do something that dishonors God, that job is not worth doing. And some of you may have been put in positions before, maybe now or previously, where you were asked to do something that wasn't necessarily what God would want you to do. And that's a really hard decision to make because there are real consequences when you're talking about a job where you get paid for. But you have to ask yourself, which is more important, honoring God or your perceived security? Your money, your finance, which is more important? But see, honoring God with your work won't happen by accident. We are called to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Matthew, Jesus says that in Matthew chapter 5. He calls us to do that, to make the world a better place, but it's not going to happen by accident. It's not going to happen by wishful thinking. It's going to happen by actually doing something. Now, I say that, and I recognize sometimes we don't feel real valued. Sometimes we can feel really, really small. And maybe that's because we think what we're doing is insignificant. Maybe because others have made us feel insignificant. And one of the jobs I had that made me feel that way was my work as a teller at a bank. See, after I graduated college, as I was doing graduate work, I got a job at National City that was then bought out by PNC Bank. And I was a teller. And PNC Bank at the time was either the fourth or fifth largest bank in the nation. If you're familiar with the Pittsburgh Pirates, their field is called PNC Park. And now I want to preface this. It was a really good job. Flexible hours with my classes, had benefits, decent pay. It was what I needed. I wish they would have told me in the interview that they were robbed at gunpoint a month beforehand, but they withheld that information. But it was a really good job. But I remember how small I felt in this corporation, that I felt in a lot of ways I was working for the man. Now, they were fair to me. They didn't do anything wrong, but they didn't really care about me. And I remember several things about that job, and this was way back in 2009, 2010. I still remember how I was required to answer the telephone. You had to have 4 things. You had to say, thank you for calling National City, because that's still the name on the door. Thank you for calling National City. Now a part of PNC. That was the second part, because PNC had bought the bank. My name is Jeff. How may I assist you? And I mean, they were very clear. You had to say the word assist, because we were not helping them. We were partnering with them and their financial goals and needs. And I was like, I'm a teller. Who cares? But I felt really, really small, because this is huge corporation, huge conglomerate, and I was just a part-time teller at a bank that they were actually closing that specific branch. Right? That's how I felt. We can feel that way. But God doesn't want you to feel that way. In Ephesians chapter 2, we're reminded of several powerful things. Paul writes, God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so none of us can boast about it. For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. These 3 verses have a lot of content, a lot of power for us. And probably the biggest thing we remember about these is we are saved by grace through faith. That is the biggest takeaway from what Paul is saying here, the thing we remember the most. And when I think of the concept of grace, I always love to pair it with mercy, because those 2 concepts go hand in hand, but are kind of opposite of each other. Grace is not receiving something you do deserve. Grace is receiving something you do not deserve. I don't deserve salvation. God's grace gives me salvation. I don't deserve heaven. Jesus, through his grace, provides a way for me to get to heaven. Mercy is the opposite. Mercy is not receiving something you do deserve. I deserve condemnation. I deserve judgment. I deserve hell. But through Jesus, I don't have to have those things because of his mercy. And so we recognize that God has saved us and provided a way for us to be saved, even though we did not deserve it, and we do not deserve it. But we have this concept of belief or faith. We are saved by grace through faith, through what we believe. And believe is more than an intellectual acknowledgement. It's more than saying things in my mind. It's about believing them in my heart. And when I believe them in my heart, it changes my behavior. It changes how I live. It changes how I act. And it also changes how I think, because I have believed in Jesus in my heart. So my belief is displayed, and it brings a change in my life. But salvation is not a reward for actions. See, Paul is very careful here. Being saved is by grace through faith. It's not because you did anything. It's not because you accomplished anything. It's not because of works righteousness. It's not because you did enough work to have the merit to earn your way to get to heaven. Paul makes sure we recognize that this is a gift. We focus on grace is a gift. Salvation is a gift that you can't earn, that you can't buy, that you can't get. You cannot earn your salvation, so there's no reason to boast. So as each and every one of us walk into this room today, I hope we recognize the humility that should be present. We walk into this place knowing that I don't deserve to be saved, but Jesus saved me. You don't deserve to be saved, but Jesus saved you. We don't deserve that. And we have this collective recognition that we didn't deserve it, but Jesus provides this free gift for each and every one of us. He provides it for us, not because we deserve it, but because he loves us. And he also gives us his Spirit. And the Holy Spirit empowers you to do the work that he has called you to do. Because you know what? There's nothing special about you. Just like there's nothing special about me. The only thing that makes us have value is because of Jesus living in us. God's grace is what sets you apart. God's grace is what makes you holy. And so we must never downplay God's grace. You may have skills that people find desirable, You may have resources or knowledge that make people say this person has value. But from an eternal standpoint, the only reason you have value is because of the grace of Jesus Christ, not because of what you can or cannot accomplish. And with this, Paul reminds us, he says, you are God's masterpiece. I don't know who needed to hear that today, but I'm sure somebody did. No matter what you're going through, you are God's masterpiece. And you are not a mistake. Now, some of you may not have been planned by your parents. But God wasn't surprised. God didn't say, oh, what am I going to do now? You were created on purpose. You were created intentionally, and you were created without mistakes. God does not make mistakes. So as we think about the fact that we are God's masterpiece, and He has created us to do the works that He planned long ago, sometimes we can feel overwhelmed by that because we think, I can't do that. I can't fulfill these expectations. I can't accomplish all that. But you know, the only thing required is faithfulness. That's what God requires from you. He doesn't require you to be successful. He doesn't require you to be talented. He requires you to be faithful. If you remember the parable of the talents, where the owner gives talents to various servants, and there's the one servant, he gives a single talent, and this servant is scared. The servant hides the talent and then returns the talent to the master when he returns. And that servant is condemned, not because the servant failed, but because the servant did nothing. Because the servant was not faithful with what the master had given. Jesus is not concerned if you succeed or if you fail. He is concerned if you will be faithful. Because if we are faithful, whether we succeed or fail is up to Jesus. It's not up to me anymore. In a lot of ways, that takes off the pressure of, I don't have to worry and judge from the worldly perspective. I can be faithful to Jesus, and then He will take care of the results. See, we don't focus on what we have. We don't focus on what we don't have. We focus with being faithful. Because each and every one of us was created with a purpose. And you were created with work for you to do. And so you were created not to be lazy. You were created to do work. But this work that you were created to do is not to be successful from a worldly standpoint. If you are, great. But the important metric is, am I faithful? And so we have to ask ourselves, what is God calling me to do? And how can I use what God has gifted me with for His glory? But as my work with the bank made me feel like a really small person, sometimes we feel our efforts really aren't that big of a deal. Nobody really cares. This isn't a job anybody cares about, or this is not a position that people actually find meaningful. When I was in college, for 2 years, I worked as a janitor for the freshman boys' dorm. And not a real pleasant place to work when you think about these 18, 19-year-olds spending their first moments of freedom from their parents and the creativity that they come up with in those moments. And it was a really good job. The head janitor, I knew him in high school. His daughter was on the district with me, and so I knew the family. And but I remember my job with that. I'd work 6 days a week, and Monday through Friday, I would be in charge of cleaning the sinks and the mirrors in all the bathrooms. And then on the weekend, I could do it Friday or Saturday, come and spend a couple hours taking out the trash and just doing any miscellaneous things that needed to be done over the weekend. And it was a convenient job because it fit well with my schedule, and it allowed me to make a little bit of money. And I say a little bit, focus on little, because I remember I was making $7.25, which was below the minimum wage in the state at the time. But because I was a student, they could pay me whatever they really wanted. But I can't say very often I felt like I was doing meaningful things when I was cleaning toothpaste off the sink, or spit off the mirror, or taking the trash out on the weekends. But just because I didn't feel like it was meaningful doesn't mean that it actually lacked meaning. See, whatever we are called to do, Jesus is calling us to be faithful, not successful from a worldly standpoint. We have to make sure we have the proper measurement so we can tell if we're doing what we're supposed to or not. But regardless of where we are, God has uniquely gifted and positioned you to impact others for Him. And it's important for us to recognize because of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 9. Starting in verse 37, He says, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest. Ask Him to send more workers into His fields." So there's a need, and Jesus recognizes it. He says there is a need for more workers in the field. And every nonprofit, almost without exception, could always use more volunteers. That's how the world works. There's always more volunteers that are needed. But I want to tell you today that you make a difference. And I worded it that way. It's not you can make a difference. I'm saying you make a difference. Because if you serve, you make a difference. And if you don't serve, you make a difference. So whether you choose to do this or not do this, whatever that is, you make a difference. And your presence or absence is noted and impacts others. But what Jesus is telling us here is that the opportunities almost always exceed the workforce. The harvest is plentiful. There are opportunities out there, and it's a matter of, do we have enough workers for that? Because Jesus is going to give us, if we show up, if we're ready, if we're prepared, Jesus is going to give us the opportunities. The opportunities are always going to be there. And so that's why your efforts make a difference. And He tells us that the harvest is ready. Now, I don't want to belabor the agricultural metaphor too much, particularly when we have the cornfield just right out west here of the church. That if you're not aware, we plant, grow, pick, and sell sweet corn, all for missions. Almost $250,000 in the last 26 years, all for missions. But when the harvest is ready, you can't wait. You got to go now. Because if you wait too long, the harvest is going to go bad. When you wait too long, you're going to miss those opportunities. That the fruit won't be good anymore. That the plants will begin to wither and not be healthy. You can't wait. You have to go now. And as followers of Jesus, what He's telling us is you can't wait. The harvest is ready now. Not soon, not in the future. The harvest is ready now. And part of what we recognize is there's an urgency that if we don't go into the field, do the work that Jesus has called us to do, if we don't go be Jesus' witnesses and share the good news of Jesus Christ, people are going to miss it. It's ready now. We can't wait. The time to act is now. So this comes back to you were created not to be lazy. You were created to work. You were created to be Jesus' workers in the field now. And the harvest is great. The harvest is plentiful. It's not as though it's an okay crop. It's not just going to, well, there's some there. If you look hard enough, you'll find it. The harvest is plentiful. The opportunities are there. And you can think of your life, of the people that you interact with on a regular basis. There are people you interact with on a regular basis that don't know Jesus. And she's saying that the harvest is ready. The time for you to work is now. Now, part of this can be overwhelming because Jesus is saying there is always going to be more opportunity than you can handle yourself. There may be times where you walk with someone and you share Jesus with them, you bring them to Jesus, and then you walk with them their entire lives and you are their main mentor. But in most cases, that is not what happens. That we work together. That we have this harvest that comes in. That you are not responsible to do everything yourself, but you are responsible to be faithful to the opportunities that Jesus gives you. One of my common prayers is that Jesus would give us opportunities, but he also would give us the courage to take advantage of those opportunities. Because sometimes, and courage isn't always the perfect word there. A lot of times we can just be hesitant. A lot of times we can be unmotivated. But whatever it is, make sure we don't allow those opportunities to slip away. So when Jesus tells us, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send workers into the field, I think there are kind of two layers to what this is saying. First off, Jesus is telling us to don't do things by yourself. It's a lot easier to ask somebody, hey, can you come help serve with me in this way, than it is to stand up here and say, hey, we need volunteers for this position. Because we do. We could use more volunteers in our kids department. We could use more volunteers in our teen department. We didn't have teen Sunday school today because we didn't have a leader because of sickness. But we can use more volunteers in those departments and areas and everywhere. But it's a lot more compelling to say, hey, can you come help serve with me? So Jesus is saying we don't do it alone. He's also saying, I think at some levels, of sometimes you need to get out of the way so somebody else can serve there. We get pretty comfortable where we serve. This is my spot. I mean, think about it. Think of your homes for a moment. You probably have a specific spot on the couch or a specific recliner that you sit in. And you know what? If a guest comes, you may let the guest sit there. But as followers of Jesus, sometimes we have to say, am I sitting in this spot because it's comfortable and it's familiar? Or am I sitting in this spot because this is where Jesus has called me to be? Some of you are laughing because you've sat in the same pews for years, I'm sure. Right? Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, we have to make sure we make space for other people. Now, making space for other people doesn't mean that I don't have to serve anymore, because we are created to work. But it means we have new opportunities that Jesus is giving us. You see, the gospel calls us not to do things on our own. It calls us to share this good news. And there's this mentality that the only way to have something done right is do it myself. You know what? That's not the gospel thinking. If that was the gospel thinking, Jesus would not have had 12 disciples. Jesus would not invite us to participate in the work that he's doing in this world. Because Jesus can do our job far better than we can. But he invites us to participate with him, because that's part of the gospel thinking of this community, of this togetherness, of coming together to focus on Jesus together. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what does God want me to do? How am I called to serve? Because each and every one of us are called to serve. William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, has a quote that I really enjoy. He says, "Not called, did you say? Not heard the call, I think you should say." Now, there's a little different context with the Salvation Army and other denominations. But the fact of the matter is, if you're saying, well, I don't know where Jesus wants me to serve, you may have struggled discerning that, but Jesus has called you to serve. No matter who you are, no matter what life setting you're at, Jesus has called you to serve. And so you can ask basic questions of, what gifts do I have? What passions do I have? And how can I use those for Jesus? Those are minor things. Those are little things. Those are minor questions that can have major ramifications in what it means to follow Jesus. Now, my first real job where I would work regular hours was for a carpenter, was for Stan Rimley Construction. And Stan is my uncle. And we'd do carpentry, we'd build houses, we'd frame, we'd side, we'd roof, we'd do drywall, we'd run electric, we would do anything, flooring, trim, paint, anything. We wouldn't do plumbing, and that was the real main thing that we wouldn't do because of the laws in the state. But it was not a job that I just loved, but it's a job I have great memories from, and I look back and see how all the experiences helped me. But there were three things required to work there. As a worker, I started when I was 16. I had no experience. I'd never used a miter saw or a circular saw or half the tools that were there. I'd never used those before, but there were only three things required. You had to have your own tool belt, you had to have your own hammer, and you had to have your own tape measure. Now, I remember I had a 25-foot tape measure, and apparently that didn't measure up because everybody else had a 35-foot tape measure, so I was the butt of a joke for a while. But everything else would be provided. Every other tool I needed would be provided. Every skill I needed would be taught. Every instruction would be given to me. So I just need to show up with those basic items. And I share that today because there's not a whole lot required for you to serve Jesus. You just need a few basic things. You need this faith in Jesus. You need to who is this Jesus? And explore this Jesus. You don't even have to have Jesus all figured out to serve Jesus. Say, I want to know more about this Jesus. Who is he? Is this somebody worth serving? A lot of times we think we have to have everything figured out. We have to have the whole game plan spelled out. We have to have a business plan that we get approved by the bank before we can actually start serving Jesus. And there's importance in planning, there's important instruction and preparation. But sometimes we just need to start. And some of you, that may be starting for the first time. Some of you, that may mean starting something different because I got comfortable sitting in the same spot. And Jesus is calling me to somewhere new. So you were not created to be lazy. You were not created to be complacent. You were not created to do the same thing you've always done. You were created to work for Jesus. But remember, work for Jesus is not about worldly success. It's not about conforming to somebody else. It's about showing up with open hands saying, Jesus, use me. And that looks different for all of us. And not only is that okay, but that's beautiful. The fact that you don't look like me is beautiful. Right? And the fact that we can do this together is beautiful. So we're called to serve Jesus, allow him to use our gifts and passion for his glory, and then watch what he does through us.